All right. Hey, what's up, everyone? We're back for another episode of the Pair Program. I'm your host, Tim, accompanied with my co-host, Mike. Mike, how's it going?
It's going great. How you doing?
Doing good. I'm excited for today's episode. So today we're going to be talking about a topic covering tech debt. So, something that most product startups will face at some point in their evolution. We'll define it. We'll discuss some of the different types. We'll recommend some ways of managing it. And we have some excellent guests here to help us dissect that topic. So Leo and Jeff, thanks again for joining us, guys.
Thanks for having
me. Cool. All right. So before we dive into the discussion, as you guys are aware, we like to kick things off with a fun segment that we call Pair Me Up.
Pair me up.
Classic. So this is a segment where we all go around the room. We call out complimentary pairings. And Mike, kick things off for us, man. Why don't you start with your pairing?
I think my pairing is going to be bad hair and a hat because that's what's going on today. My barber moved and I haven't found a new one, and that was back in like November. So,
oh gosh,
how about no hair and a
hat? That's another good one. No hair and a hat.
No hair and a hat. That is a good one. So there you go. So nice. Tim, throw it back to you.
Yeah. So I'm going to go with meme stocks and FOMO. And this is something that I fall victim to the craze. Tried riding like the GameStop wave at one point. Didn't work out. And, by the time I hear about it, like most folks, it seems like it's obviously too late. And I have this sense of FOMO. So I thought that was kind of a pairing. I was curious if any of you guys did any of you get in on any of the meme stocks at the right time?
Yeah, I made $100 on AMC and lost $100 on GameStop. So.
They're incredible. It balances out. It's the circle of life, right?
Yeah, you're even. You're even. You're good. Cool. Well, let's pass it over to our guest, Leo. I'd love to get your intro and what your pairing is.
Awesome. My name's Leo Hentschker. I'm the CTO at Quorum. We're a public benefit corporation based all over the place in the U.S. We're remote, but now about 40 folks. Actually got to know the Hatch folks from DC, but now I am headquartered in Miami. And I would say that my pairing is going to be cold brew and chocolate croissants. I have just recently discovered a bakery across the street from me, which blows my mind. It's called Zach the Baker. I am obsessed with this place. And so my recent slightly dangerous morning routine is I get 2 cold brews and a chocolate croissant, and it's just amazing. It has materially improved my quality of existence by just an egregious factor.
Nice.
When did the shakes set in?
Exactly.
Oh, don't worry. They're already there. It's beautiful.
They're permanent at this point. That's great. Cool. Well, Jeff, quick intro and your pairing.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Nettleton. I'm a staff engineer at Color, which is a health tech company out in San Francisco, doing a lot of COVID testing and vaccination right now. I know the Hatch folks from DC as well when I was at Aledade, and always had a great time working with them. I'm gonna have to say my favorite pairing right now is Vim and Z Shell, which just a powerful toolbox. So that's what I've been using for many years.
I'm old school. I like run Vim as in VI mode, shut down everything, and also still use the same shell that I've always used since college, so T shell. But I do love Z shell. But
nice.
Vim that's a powerful combo.
Real nerd stuff.
Real nerd stuff. Yeah, exactly.
That's a dangerous take. That's not saying you're pro Vim absent checking with the other members of the group to see if there's strong opinions. It's a bold move. I respect it.
I'm sure we'll get some comments on it. That's fine. We'll embrace that.
I'm sure there's a bunch of Emacs users out there still trying to figure out how to exit Vim, so we're all good.
I had to sync an attempt to move our development to GitHub Codespaces because no VS Code for me, please.
Well, good stuff. Well, let's dive into the discussion here, guys. I want to make the most of our time, and so as I mentioned before, this is going to be an episode talking about tech debt. And I thought it'd be cool to just kind of kick off with a quote from Ward Cunningham, who's iconic software engineer. He was credited with kind of coining the phrase tech debt back in 1992. And a quote from him saying, "Shipping first-time code is like going into debt. a little debt speeds development so long as it is paid back promptly with a rewrite. The danger occurs when the debt is not repaid. Every minute spent on not quite right code counts as interest on that debt. Entire engineering organizations can be brought to a standstill under the debt load of an unconsolidated implementation, object-oriented or otherwise. So obviously that's a little bit more wordy and technical, but Leo, let's start with you and maybe simplify this for our audience. Why don't you begin and kind of describe maybe what tech debt means to you?
Yeah, well, I would say also clearly that person has never heard of modern monetary theory because debt, who cares these days? No, but when I think about tech debt, I really think about kind of the experience I have pretty frequently in my role of looking back at the code base, looking at the things that we've written and wishing that we could move faster, but feeling held back by the constraints of decisions that we made in the past. Whether it be the decision not to spend the time that we needed on testing, the decision to implement something in a way that ended up being not scalable, the decision to do something quickly that we knew would not cover all the edge cases we need. And it's pretty constant, right? I think I would really challenge you to find any engineering leader who says, wow, looking back at this code I wrote and my team wrote a year ago, I am so happy with every possible decision that we made. But I think for me, really, when I think about what tech debt is it goes down to that feeling of looking back and looking at decisions we made that were local optima, that were decisions that we made with the resources, decision-making process, and kind of structures we had in place at the time that have since proved to be a very local optimum, not even close to the global. And that's generally how I think about it. It's the decisions you make at a given point in time that upon later reflection turn out to be materially not correct in hindsight.
Good stuff. Yeah. Mike, if you want to maybe follow up on that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think of when I think about technical debt, to me the important part is the product sort of involved. Like everybody's involved in making that decision. Like we recognize that this is suboptimal. But we're going to do speed. We've decided that we need to just stop the analysis paralysis and get something shipped. And we'll revisit this. And I think your take, I'm curious where the route, because you were saying about looking in hindsight at some of the suboptimal decisions we made. There's some decisions that you make that you can't foresee where the problem's going to be. And for those, I tend not to think too much in terms of technical debt, in terms of where I think about it is okay, as soon as we've identified the problem and we've raised the problem, at the moment that we've raised the problem and decided not to address it, that's when the sort of tech debt clock kind of starts. Ooh. You can make lots of decisions that turn out to be suboptimal, right? But I would prefer, but the other thing, the counter to that is you can spend a year trying to figure out all possible things and make something scalable, and then you haven't delivered shit. So you're out of business.
Totally.
So there's definitely, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So I actually don't draw a distinction between those two things. And I think part of it comes down to, at the end of the day, I do not believe that myself or other members or other people that I work with are making the conscious decision to do bad work. I really don't think that happens frequently. I think it's much more common that someone is in and maybe bad work is the wrong term.
I was going to say,
or even bad work. Right. Yeah. Let me update that. That's a good call out. It's I don't think that people are making the conscious decision to do incomplete work. It's just in the framework that you have at the company at a given period of time, and based on what you define as being complete, things get out, right? And so, and from my perspective, it doesn't really matter if it's lack of foresight or it's lack of a framework in place to create scalable, high quality work. It has the same result, right? It ends up in kind of that outcome-oriented mind. It has the same outcome here of looking in hindsight and being frustrated and unhappy with what you've done in the past there. And I think that's why I really do view technical debt as being inevitable. I think it's impossible to move around.
Absolutely, it's absolutely inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in that light, I really like the framing of kind of viewing it as such, because I think it removes some of that stigma that otherwise happens when you frame it more in the line of making that conscious effort to do something and avoid some work. Is that most frequently, this is a product of the way that your team works, the structures you have in place, and kind of the resources you have available. It's not down to individual agency as much, at least is my perspective.
So speaking speaking as someone who has intentionally done bad work for the sake of expediency, I think it can actually absolutely be true that sometimes that's for the greater good. For instance, you need to get a contract signed. They want you to have this implemented next week. The only way to do it right is going to take 3 weeks. So you do the hacky version, get the contract signed, and then revisit it. I think that's absolutely a thing that happens, a thing that I've done, and a thing that I've fixed later. So yeah, but you're right that in most cases, it is just a product of the way that the team works. I think where the danger comes in is when the team becomes habituated to working that way and then doesn't ever change that. And then you start getting into the phase where you are spending so much time paying back the debt that you're making very little forward progress.
Right. At which point then somebody will inevitably suggest we should just replatform, not really recognizing that like all of those like terrible like scars and things, the battle hardened thing that you currently have is not going to be as easy it's never as easy, but right. And that's not a great way to repay technical debt. You know, like who like buys a house and then like doesn't maintain it and then's like, okay, our house is falling down around us, we should buy a new house. Right. But yeah, I mean, and I'm with you on the same thing. Like I've made those same decisions. Like I've intentionally, like, right, if it's professional services or there's something that's going on, there are times when you're consciously making the choice. And I think as an engineer, my job is to make sure that I'm at least throwing a flag, that I'm at least letting someone know we are consciously making, like, we all agree that we're making this choice. There's nothing more frustrating than being in a meeting where you later learn, well, we made this choice, but nobody bothered saying anything. And now we didn't actually all get to weigh in on whether or not that was the right decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said, Leo, about destigmatizing it, because it has a negative connotation to it when you hear debt, and nobody wants to associate that with their, who they are or their future. But Jeff, maybe it was you that touched on this when we were first speaking about this, was like reorienting your thinking about it. I just thought it was a creative way of portraying it.
Yeah. So I think that if you consider tech debt to be a positive in an early stage organization, but at the same time, always assessing where it is irresponsible to do it, you can really make a lot of good leverage out of tech debt. Like, for an example, you're 18 years old. It makes sense to take on debt to go to university, but it doesn't make sense to take on debt when you want to buy a house. If you're 18, I don't have a job. I'm gonna buy a house. Not good, but I want to go to college so I can get a better job and then buy a house. Good stuff. And yeah, I have spent a lot of time at several jobs fixing tech debt day in and day out. And there have been plenty that it was, just a straightforward refactor, and I could totally see why they made this decision. There have been others where it was, just endless digging out of the hole, and why did they do this? This was bad. The worst example was there was even a spreadsheet from the start of the company where they had a pros and cons on various technical choices. And MySQL had this extremely long list of cons and no pros. And Postgres had this extremely long list of pros and no cons, and they went with MySQL anyway.
That is incredible. I love that so much. That's amazing.
And it bit him in the ass forever, Probably still does.
Well, and also, I would say, I think I was also telling the group here that I just had a funny experience this morning in which I think a lack of gates and checks on a build process that we have caused an issue. It caused a material issue. And actually, literally before this call, I think I was scrambling a little bit to make sure, like, hey, are we going to be fine? Am I going to have to jump off at some random point here to fight a fire? But I think because why not continue to beat the dead horse with the financial analogy? But I feel like a lot of the job of being an engineering leader, especially at something early stage, is like being Jerome Powell and saying, hey, like this is what we can handle. This is the level that we're comfortable with at this moment in time, right? Like this is what we're comfortable doing to be able to gain velocity and move quicker here. And then as the organization progresses, I think, Jeff, one of the things that you said before this that also really, really resonated with me was this idea of getting addicted to speed and getting addicted to doing things quickly and getting addicted to that kind of leverage that you can give on yourself. And as I saw today, and as we're seeing more and more as the company grows, and we're now 40 as opposed to 5, there's consequences of us not being much more tightly regulated with the way that we make some of these decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely lived through the addicted to speed, where suddenly you're like, okay, we've added more people, we've added more product management, and then suddenly there's why aren't we moving faster? We have 40 effing engineers. Why is this taking so long? And it's like, well, turns out like we have more. What we're shipping though is better quality. Like what we were doing before was very, very quick, but it also relied on us then going in and quickly fixing it. like it felt like we were making a lot of progress, but really it was a lot of iterative fast development. I think that's an interesting take, is the getting addicted to speed.
And I think engineering can sometimes be misunderstood by non-engineering company leadership, where, the company's growing, they're saying, let's bring in some really senior engineers. And then the senior engineers end up spending all their time fixing tech debt. And so, why aren't we doing the big stuff we were talking about when we hired these people? And it's like, oh, well, they're dealing with the consequences of our decision.
I guess I'm curious on to dive a little bit deeper on that in terms of like ways of managing it, and getting in front of it early on. Anything specific that you've seen that was helpful for you in your past life, Jeff? And I'd love to hear Leo's take too after that, because Leo, you're in a very unique situation with a company that's scaling very quickly. Going from C to A, and just really interesting size. So I'd love to hear that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that you can do that really helps is, even if you're writing code that is suboptimal for the reasons of speed or team size or whatever, if you keep really high, like 99% test coverage, you can always refactor it safely. But if you don't have good test coverage, there will always be some unexpected behavior. Then you end up with a prod outage, and then you're spending more time fixing things and not moving forward. And that is something that I have learned through experience. Going quickly and not writing tests, really bad combo.
The irony of that, of course, is that tests are the first thing you discard when trying to move quickly.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the first bit of technical debt you accrue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I actually had a really fun conversation recently with someone who was the CTO of a company also in a really similar stage. And we just spent half of our time talking about how quickly irrelevant all of our jest tests became. We spent both of us made this big kind of cohesive push within the teams. Like, okay, great, we're going to buckle down. We're going to get these tests, and we're going to really, really orient around getting these good, spend time, reduce flakiness, get these in there. And then in just unbelievably short order, it felt like all of that work became incredibly irrelevant. But hey, it was a stable time, and so I think I can't argue with the results on that front.
Nice.
I'm curious how you guys, like, what you guys have dealt with, like, in terms of for the non-engineering, right? For like, I think it's pretty easy. Like, a good product manager usually gets it, and it's not that big a deal. But as you get further and further away from engineering, you get into other parts of the organization. Like, do you even talk about technical debt, or do you try and phrase it in other ways because there's such a negative stigma, or do you try and talk about how technical debt actually is a positive thing? Like, I'm just curious what your take on that is, and how you talk to other parts of the org about tech debt.
Yeah, I really like the maybe just call it a saying of, you can have fast, right, and cheap, pick two. And fast and cheap is really great, but that right is the tech debt, and I think that can really help people understand what's at stake. You can do all sorts of analogies like, hey, you're getting an extension added to your house. Do you want it fast, right, and cheap? Pick two, and they'll sort of see the light there.
Mm.
Yeah.
One of the things that we we're in the early phases of this, and so I'm going to be curious to see how this goes and what and how. At the moment, I'm very happy with it, but we'll see if this kind of translates. Is that we've started to get much more explicit around effectively tracking things within Jira. We actually just made a switch from GitHub to Jira, which has been kind of life changing, honestly. Because what we've now been able to do is so the first thing we did here was we literally within our CI enforced that you are unable to merge to either a staging or a production branch absent linking to a Jira ticket and having a category on that Jira ticket. And what it did for the first time was force visibility across what are the changes across the organization actually benchmarked on. Like what are they against? Why are they happening? What are they? And it put us today in this kind of magical position of being able to kind of communicate externally for the first time of this is the percentage of work being done on things that we are tagged bug, that things that are tagged backlog, things that are tagged we do dead, right? Like things that are tagged in that sense. Because before that, I think we were never able to quantify that in any way. It was always just this nebulous note of, well, we have to spend all this time making sure things are working well. Whereas now I feel much more confident saying, actually, X percentage of the work that we do on a going forward basis is likely going to be tied towards system improvement, which gives us, hey, if we have this, if it's X percentage required for system improvement, we have fixed costs related to go lives. The expectation is for the implementations that we're doing, there's going to be a fixed cost. That gives us this much bandwidth for new product work. If we want to increase that number, awesome, let's hire more people. Otherwise, that number is going to stay here, and we're only going to be able to do X on a per sprint cycle basis. But I think that type of analysis, more effectively tracking in Jira, is never something that we were able to do.
It's funny because I had almost identical experiences twice. First, when I hired a program manager and she spent all of this time going into Confluence and Jira and building all these things that could actually accurately show us like, this is the amount of new work we're working on and this is the amount of rework. Let's all agree rework is bad. New work is good. And once we started tracking that and being able to see that, that was like, yeah, definitely life changing in terms of being able to communicate that. And then at my last job, I basically was like, that worked really well. So I did that again, where we just sort of tagged things a little bit. And I was able to, in my management meetings, say like, okay, this is the percentage of new stuff we're working on. This is rework. This is my like goal. Like I have an OKR around trying to get us to this, and we can drive towards that. And then when there were like weird spikes or whatever, I could be like, oh yeah, well, this was when we decided that we want, like, remember when we made this terrible decision and I said it was a terrible decision? Well, this is the rework of that terrible decision we all agreed that we were going to do. And it made the conversations a lot easier, like, because I was able to say like, by the way, we will be paying this off at some point in the future. And then when it happened, I would be able to tag it and say like, this is it. This was the result of our decision. Next time we're having this conversation, I'm going to pull this up and you're going to know what we're getting into. So I have very similar experience. I think it's a great way to sort of frame it up.
I will say on the subject of not allowing merges without Jira tickets, I have at a couple companies had the experience of a large portion of my job being like spelunking through the monitoring to see which endpoints have a high P95, and then going into that endpoint, fixing some query or fixing some N+1 problem. And, the Git blame is from 6 years ago from an engineer that left 4 years ago. There's, of course, no Jira ticket. And just like, you just write as detailed a commit description as you can and call it a day.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the points that we're covering here, which I think is fascinating, which a lot of people don't think through as a derivative of tech debt, is like how it impacts the work environment, like the culture, and how if it's not addressed, or I like the way that you put it, Leo, of like that visibility across the org to eliminate what a lot of folks have said, like the blame game, right? I'm curious if there's any specific examples or what else you've seen of like how this can impact the work culture, because you've got these different teams all working towards this product, but maybe it's like feature prioritization and who knows what's coming out first, and any specific thoughts on that?
I will say that you just said a very interesting word. That is a concept that I have been thinking about recently in going into recording this podcast. The derivative, I watched some movies about The Big Short recently and have been thinking about that whole financial housing market collapse was based on making additional financial products based off of debt. And it is possible to build more tech debt as a derivative of existing tech debt that not only gets you deeper into the hole, but means that you cannot fix the original tech debt until you fix the tech debt that derives from it. That is something that is even harder to explain to non-technical folks. Like, oh, well, why can't we fix this thing? It's, oh, this whole other thing we're doing, we have to fix that first. Yeah. Sorry, that didn't answer your original question, but you said derivative, and it stuck with me.
I think that's an interesting topic, but I do think, with the culture thing, I think there is some impact. I think there's impact at lots of different places for culture, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are. But like, engineers have a totally different, like, if you have a lot of tech debt, I think it can be frustrating for engineers to work in an environment where that's the case because they feel very hamstrung. And then there's other people who feel frustrated, but in a different way because we're not moving fast enough. I'm curious, like from a culture perspective, when you have a lot of that sort of going on, I'm curious what your thoughts are on, like, how does that affect company culture overall?
Yeah, I think one thing that can really affect company culture is when you have a large proportion of engineers whose first and only job was at a company that does everything based on tech debt. Even getting them to understand that there is a different way can be hard. Like, not only should we not be doing this, but let me first teach you that there is a way that isn't this. And, teaching people new habits is one of the hardest things about humans. And that can be a huge component of a culture where, you've got to not only convince people to change, but convince them that changing is even possible.
Right. Or the right thing to do.
Yeah, for sure.
I think also the note around kind of team impact is super relevant here because I, at least personally, and I think I've seen this a lot, is that the kind of self-conception of a group of people is incredibly impactful for the work that they do. Mm-hmm. And I think if folks spend too much time, or the majority, plurality, or whatever of their time exclusively focused on what feels like a mistake, the self-conception is, oh, we're a team who makes mistakes, right? That's like the dominant mental story of like, oh, most of my time is spent fixing mistakes. That's because mostly we're not good, right? Like, maybe we're not good. Maybe we can't do things right. Maybe we're not a group who's able to do this. And I think that I've seen this particularly when teams that I have been on are kind of strapped for resources in terms of number of people, because at least for us and our business, there is a certain fixed amount of work that's required for supporting customers that we have. And so if the combination of the fixed amount of work for supporting customers in the early phases of when they're going live, plus technical debt is the totality of time, that can really make it feel like, oh no, we're not a group who's in a position to really innovate here. We don't have the resources. We don't have the bandwidth to really innovate. And I think it's not a product of the group being incapable. It's just really a function of hours that are available within a group to even try to solve that problem. And if you don't ever make it past that threshold to even have the resources available to actually start making progress, it can be hard. And then the self-conception is a group that doesn't ship new things. And that's right. The worst.
That's a really interesting one because I think there's two components to that. There's the resources and resource availability, right? Like everything, there's a fixed amount of whatever, whether it's people to do work, hours, whatever, it all comes down to fixed number of resources, which gets into prioritization and how you prioritize. And frequently, I think people are like, oh, we don't make time to do blah, or we don't. No, it's like, no, we're prioritizing onboarding new customers. That's what we've decided to prioritize, and fixing technical debt and not innovating. And so I think sometimes engineers especially can only, that's what they feel and that's what they see. And I think it's important to maybe try to address that in some sort of way of like, well, we're making this conscious decision because getting more customers onboarded will lead to more money, which will allow us to hire more engineers, which will allow us to actually start innovating, versus a lot of like, I remember really early on, like me thinking like, man, if these guys would just stop and slow down a little bit, like we could fix this. And it's like, well, yeah, if we stop and slow down a little bit, we'll also go out of business. And it's like, you don't have all of the information when you're slinging the code. So I think it's important to actually talk about that stuff, to try and explain why we're making the decisions we're making and why we're prioritizing what we're prioritizing. That can go a long way to sort of addressing that we don't have enough resources to do everything.
Yeah, speaking of resources too, I mean, I guess this is a point that we can certainly talk on from a recruiting and hiring perspective, right? Like from a timing, issue of, how long is it going to take us to get the right engineers in here for this build? This is where, you kind of have to let a little bit of your guard down in terms of how picky you want to be, because the longer that is delayed, you talk about that debt buildup, it's gonna cause a lot of toxic things to the company at large. And they're like, well, why isn't that position getting filled? Well, it's partially because you're looking for this, this unicorn engineer. You might need to flex a little bit on that, because we can find you somebody a little quicker if you tweak the requirement just a tad.
The new grad that has 10 years of experience.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And also, I think, especially, and this is now, please forgive what is going to be a slightly brief soapbox here, I think when you, especially at some of these early stages, when you're looking for people to join an early stage engineering organization, often the best predictor for effectiveness within that organization is not the best predictor for effectiveness within a large engineering company that has been existing for 10 years. It's different things. It's absolutely different things. And I think from our end, we have seen that literally, we have seen that literally, that some of the people at the company who are the most effective came in with the least background. And some of the folks who took longer to ramp up have more experience. And that's super natural, I think, for early stage companies. And I think if you talk to almost anyone across the board, they're going to see that. And I think both folks have a really material role to play of having someone who is early in a job, who wants to get in the weeds, who wants to spelunk and learn things and figure things out and be a part of that rough and tumble of the early stages is incredibly powerful. And I also think so much more powerful when you have that person with a senior engineer than just people who are senior engineers who are objective, who come into an environment and be like, oh my God, this is 1/10 of what I would want or what I'm used to from in my other context. But actually in this position, just have this person coupled with someone who wants to learn what this person knows and they can work together to actually improve a system. I think that is so magical. I think that is so unbelievably magical.
I completely agree. I think that there are different engineers for different stage companies. It's not necessarily the case that an engineer can't be successful at those different stages, but there's a different mindset when you're early on versus and so forth. And to recognize that, I think the other thing, to Tim's point, that I think is interesting, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations of yeah, if we had hired somebody 3 months ago, we would have been in a much better position. But and we've almost created recruiting debt, where interviewing debt or whatever, where the amount of work we have to get done precludes us from even spending the time to try and find the right people and to do effective interviews. And it can be kind of daunting. And it's we'll after this sprint, we'll get to it. And then it's it just you kick the can, and then you don't really do the hiring that you need to do to address what is coming down the pike. I'm curious if people have similar. Yeah.
I'm sure Tim can remember sometimes in Aledade when we were throwing out we don't have any time to interview, so only send us people, that have this and this and this. And
yeah, I've got some early gray hairs, I think, as a result of some of that. But yeah, I mean, this is a topic that's an episode in itself, honestly, is that mold of a startup engineer. And those foundations that maybe it's that is a piece of a mold of an engineer that maybe is a little bit more adapted to understanding tech debt, because they've been in this startup environment at an early stage. And it's been a little bit more of it's almost like that you got to play with a little bit of a budget here. It's not just go wild on your spend.
Yep. You know what you're getting into.
And totally. And also to one of the people who the person who I look up to so unbelievably highly in this space is Charity Majors, who has this note that I love about startup teams as well, is that when you're hiring, it's about the team. It's not about individuals that you're bringing on that team. It's about the team dynamic and the team structure. Mm-hmm. And that has been incredibly impactful for me for how I think about this as well. Because having 6 people come in who have only worked in an environment absent any of that type of issue, I do not think would work well.
Yeah,
also,
totally
quick hot take that I'm going to throw out there that I'm curious to see if people disagree with is I would say every single time we have ever in the history of this company implemented a class hierarchy for abstraction, it has been a horrible idea. I'm not even kidding. Like pretty much every single time we have, absent a literal year of getting things slightly more extensible, I have regretted it every single time. And every single time I've ever imported image magic, I have been sad. those are my two things. If I have ever using image magic, I know it's because there's going to be a catastrophe in 6 months. I just know it. And if there is a class, I will hate it shortly. Those are my two things I can always turn back to that I know will be the case.
Yeah, you want pillow instead of image magic. Python imaging library. And yeah, for sure. You almost never need inheritance unless you're modifying some framework that isn't yours to begin with.
It's so true. And that to me feels like one of those interesting, meaningful deviations from what you learn in practice. You really rarely need inheritance. Almost never. It's almost always the incorrect call. And that is always so shocking to me but like on every axis of readability, maintenance, simplicity, almost every single time we have chosen abstraction over copying and pasting something in two different places, we have regretted it.
Doesn't sound very enterprise. I'm kidding.
Well,
I mean, but do you think that if you think about where OO came from and inheritance and the rest of it, it's also from the days when we had waterfall like methodologies. Like it's just a different time. I think that it's probably a whole nother topic. I mean, like I would love to go.
Of course, this is a product of the stage the company's at, because everything we're doing right now is encountering the fact that early on we made those incorrect structural decisions. Well,
right. I mean, the fact is, I think most engineering decisions are like suboptimal optimization. Like we don't understand the optimization. Anytime we're trying to optimize, we're really bad at optimizing. Humans suck at it.
I would say this is one benefit of starting with a language like C, where you don't have any of that, and you need to learn the best practices without any sort of like modern paradigm at all, is a really powerful tool. I know schools have stopped doing that.
That's a hot take. Sorry, are you saying like from a company perspective or from an individual learning perspective?
From an individual perspective, yeah.
Okay, thank God.
No.
I'm advocating for assembly. That's all we're going to write in.
Okay, I had a professor. Oh, go for it.
I was going to say, if I had my choice, I'd rewrite it in Rust. You know?
I had a professor who it was amazing speaking with them, because he'd be like, "See, bloatware. I won't use it ever." And he'd be like, "Are you really bloatware?" He's like, "Yes, inefficient bloatware. Don't even show me it." I was just made me laugh.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we had a lot of hot takes on this one. I like that. Exactly. I'll add one to it as well. So like your Big Short reference, Jeff, I think Adam McKay is one of the greatest directors of like our time. He's just genius. Like the Anchorman too. Like Anchorman was just freaking great. But yeah, just be mindful here. So we do want to transition into another segment. We've got just about 10 minutes left. So I'm gonna ask you guys have any last comments on Tech Debt before we transition? We'll probably need another episode, to be honest with you, just to dissect it deeper. Yeah. But I think that was a good riff for about 20, 30 minutes. So cool. Well, let's dive into this next segment. This community wheel behind me is a segment called Round Out My Career. And this is an area where, we kind of crowdsource some topics and questions from the Hatchpad community. And it's more, a little bit more geared around career growth, hence the name. So the topics can range anything from like compensation to diversity to interviewing. So we'll go to give it a spin and see what today's topic is.
Are we getting a lucky Raspberry Pi winner?
No winner this time.
No winner. All right.
We're saving on our debt through no.
Yeah, saving on the literal debt. I love it. What does it land on?
Raspberry Pi is going to cause a literal debt. I think we need to rethink some things.
Yeah, we don't want to disclose that publicly. All right, so it landed on mentorship. So could be mentorship / coaching here. Let me see here. I'm going to just pull something that we've got in this category. All right. So what are areas outside of the engineering or product department that you believe are the most valuable to the growth of a startup technologist?
I would say,
Jeff.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, being able to understand what a business does, why they do it, and then being able to map what you're doing as an engineer to that is huge. I think a lot of people aren't able to make that connection to, okay, we have this feature for this client that does this, and this feature for this client that does this. But at their core, they're both doing this, some business abstraction that can be implemented in code and can really help you, when PMs come to you with, oh, we've got this requirement, you can understand why that's a requirement, even if it might seem a little esoteric.
That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah. I put the question in the comments here. So, Leo, in case you forgot the question.
It's kind of a silly one, but I think having someone teach you how to send emails is really helpful. Something that I see really frequently, and this is something that was true for me early on, and very frequent for folks on development teams early on, is that there's kind of a cadence to professional email sending that if no one tells you, you don't learn, and makes the communication you have incredibly unclear. And it's one of the, I think, most impactful experiences for me was I was working at a previous company based in it was actually Quorum, which is one of the companies based in the DC area, which I think some of the folks at Hatch know as well. And I was writing an email, and it was like 3 massive block paragraphs, and it was just horrendous. And then someone came up to me, looked at it, and said, "Who was reading this? Literally, who was reading this?" And it was a bit of a wake up call for me. I'd be like, "Oh, right. Maybe there's a bit of an art here that I've always discounted to these folks on the business side who spend all their time talking about how good their email cadences are." So I know that I think that there's really quickly, if you are either growing in your role or speaking with folks externally, the dominant medium of communication that you end up using is email, and being able to do that well, succinctly, powerfully is just game changing. And so that's one that I would highlight.
I would go so far to say just communication in general, because I do agree that email, especially if you're talking external, right? Last few organizations I've worked at, I've made it a rule, like internal communications don't happen over email. Like we should use Slack for quick things and Google Docs or Office 365, whatever it is, for long form. Like I don't want, like, to me, email is like terrible. Like we could probably have a whole segment where Mike just hates on email.
I got a hot take on that, but I love it.
But anyway, email is great for external communications, but whatever. Well, let's just move on. I agree, though, that communication in general is an area where a lot of engineers struggle a little bit with the long form, how to actually, like the I didn't have time to write a short email, like that type of like sometimes it's just really long, but it doesn't need to be that long. Like just get to it. Similarly, reading, I think it's not just about writing. It's about being able to read a communication and recognize that the voice of the other person isn't malevolent. Like they're not, like there's a lot of people, I think, who take things very, like who might take a direct communication and read a little too much into it. And so I think it's not just writing. It's also the being able to read an email.
Well, on that subject, that's a great point to bring up. My old boss, Edwin, as I'm sure Tim remembers, made me read this book that at the time I was very annoyed that I had to read. But, oh my God, I'm totally blanking on the name. Maybe we can add it at the end. The whole concept of the book is this idea of you can be in the box where you have a preconceived notion about another person's intentions, and you map that notion to everything that they say. And so they told you couldn't implement something one time, so they don't like you. And you read every email through that lens. And that's a really easy trap to fall into, especially when you're new in the workplace. And, like you said, with text, there's no emotion attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's very easy to filter that in multiple ways. I always advocate, always assume someone's got good intentions until they prove that they don't.
But even then, like I've worked with, even then, like just because they had bad intent, like you can't just always assume that person is that way to that point with the person in the box.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's true. And also one thing that I think is fair and hard to realize is that just because someone can be incredibly enjoy you as a person and be unhappy with what you did. Yes. And that it's not because they're a bad person. It's not because you're a bad person. It's not because you're bad at their job or they're bad at their job. It's that there are situations people find themselves in which the outcome does not work out. The outcome was insufficient for one of the two parties. No one's fault, but that is what happened. And I think being comfortable with that and separating that from a personal relationship is incredibly hard, unbelievably hard. But to that point of it, you have to learn to be able to do that. And whatever that book is, I would love to know it.
Yeah, we'll get the
Leadership in the Art of Self-Deception just came to me. I'll type it in the chat.
Cool. Yeah, we'll throw that in the show notes.
Another good one for sort of non-engineering things is it's totally okay to screw up. You're not going to get fired. I mean, like, if you leak the whole database, that's on you. But
I mean, is it?
You can screw up. there are bugs. There are outages. It happens. I've had more than my share. It is what it is. You learn from it. Don't beat yourself up. The CEO is not going to come to your desk and punch you in the face. Like it is what it is. People are people.
Yep. It's funny that you bring that up because that's one of my favorite stories when I start managing a team or a new team or whatever, I'll sort of talk about some of my history or whatever. And I still remember my very first big screw up where like customer on the phone running my install script deleted, like basically just deleted from root on down, like learned a very valuable lesson, like install scripts shouldn't have RM in them. They should have move, stuff like that. Minor things. But he
that's so fair.
He lost it on the call. And I remember thinking like, so like, this is not good. And my manager put the phone on mute and said, don't worry about it. My fault. I should have actually reviewed some of this before it went out the door. Like, just take a deep breath. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. And like and most recently we had a similar incident where there was a security incident. Some things sort of didn't go great. Recovered. It was reported. It was dealt with. The person felt terrible. I was like, you got to not feel terrible. Like everybody makes mistakes. It's totally okay. It's just part of the job. And I think that's an important thing to recognize and call out.
It's an engineering team. It's not you screwed up. There was a whole chain of failures here. And one big thing I'm a huge advocate of is blameless incidents. So anytime something goes wrong, you have an incident and you have a postmortem and it's nobody's fault. Like there were contributing factors. Someone may have contributed more than others. That doesn't mean that it's their fault. And if you get in a habit of anytime something goes wrong, you write up an incident report, you have a postmortem, it really serves you well.
Yeah, I guess I'd add, Jeff, I really liked your first point too about, kind of almost like getting a better sense or a view of the business at large versus just like, what is my role here and what is my lane? I like this concept that some startups have done where they almost have this rotational program where you get a chance to get a taste of each department. Maybe do like a shadow, 1 week of the marketing department, or maybe it's not as appealing, but you want to get a sit down with like the CFO or the finance side of things. Just well rounding you as a business person at large, and then giving you more buy-in into the company and what you're doing with them versus like feeling like you're just this role and that's your department and that's it. So I think I really like that point of getting on board with the bigger business as an operation versus just I'm a technologist here or I'm an engineer here. Also,
at the end of the day, like works about the people in some senses. Like these are the people that you're tying yourself with, and I think broadly, it is. At least for myself, I like spending time with the people who have chosen to also work on the same thing that I care about. That is just fun. I just enjoy that. And so like independent even of what the focus is, that's something that really kind of is something that matters for me.
Good stuff.
But also it's just a job. And if you're not having fun anymore, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. I think that's a good stopping point. Thanks guys for hanging out with us and tackling this topic of tech debt. Anywhere specific that you want to shout out that, listeners can find you or follow you, feel free to do so now, or we can also, post it later.
Hit me up on LinkedIn. That's all I got.
LinkedIn.
Oh my God, amazing. Okay, I don't know. I've actually never been asked this question. That's kind of funny. I guess LinkedIn or Twitter. I could give. Also, I'll give my Twitter handle after the fact.
Cool. Awesome. All right, guys. Well, this is a wrap. Appreciate you all hanging out.